Kevin, I wanted to start with the military dimension of the news this week. We found out from the leaked files at the beginning of the week, and was reported by the American press, that Ukraine was planning to hit Moscow on the anniversary of the beginning of the war on February 24th, but was talked out of it by Washington. And there are speculations around it. And in Kyiv, they already told that Washington Post is engaging in conspirology. And I wanted to ask you whether you have any insight into whether this information is accurate. And in general, do we know how much control Washington right now has over Kyiv's plan as to where and how to hit Russia?
Yeah, good question. I don't have independent confirmation one way or another of that reporting, but it does speak to kind of the state of the war and relations with Washington. I think also to the patience or impatience of the public and the press covering the war to know when is something bigger going to happen, when is a move going to happen, right? So like the actual battle lines on the map have not moved very much in quite some time, but the thought is that there's other ways to move toward the end of the war, whether it's forcing negotiations or something else that don't have anything to do with the battle lines on the ground. And one of those steps is, does Ukraine start more overtly attacking positions inside of Russia, right? And that has always been one of the absolute no-go red line concerns for the United States and for the Pentagon, who's giving Ukraine these weapons. The idea being that if Ukraine hits Russian targets directly with American weapons, then Russia has every right to attack American bases or even American allies or NATO. So they've tried to, play this kind of smoke and mirrors game. As far as, how much does Washington control Ukraine, or does Ukraine listen to Washington? To some degree, Ukraine doesn't have much choice. Ukraine is completely dependent upon the United States and NATO allies for all of its intelligence, really, for targeting, for supply, logistics, for lots of communication. So what Ukraine is able to do is, and not to mention the actual hardware, all the way down to the bullets. They're extremely dependent upon Washington. That's the nature of the relationship. Publicly, you see the Biden administration and the Pentagon doing everything they can to make it appear that Zelensky and the Ukrainians are in charge. It's their war, it's their pace, it's their objectives, it's their targets. But then clearly you see the Washington's hand when Washington says, well, we're not going to give you things like F-16s to target some of the things you want to target. We're not going to give you more advanced ATACMS long-range missiles to target where you want to target because we, Washington, don't think you need it. So there's a little bit of give and take there from the patron to the Ukrainians.
Kevin, speaking about the hardware, and then we'll get back to the politics. We know, first of all, that UK seemed to have completed its transfer of munitions with depleted uranium in it. And then there is talk now, I know in Washington, the discussion about possibly giving Ukraine the things that are kind of prohibited by the conventions, and that is cluster bombs. And I just wanted to pack this question together and ask you about, first of all, whether there are any concerns in Washington about those depleted uranium munitions ending up in Ukraine and the cluster bombs. It seems like a big discussion issue now.
Yeah, the answer to both is yes, there are concerns, and that's why those weapons aren't there. I mean, we just had a report about cluster bombs in the last 24 hours from our staff reporter, Sam Scove, just reporting that there have been discussions about it, that the United States has talked about it internally. There are people closer to the front lines in Europe, higher up in the military, that have said it would make a difference. But usually the United States is very... how do I say, they tend to act to their own interests, right? This is the same United States that for many years does not sign on to the child soldier convention for the United Nations, simply because the military here wants to be able to recruit to 17-year-olds and sign them up for the 18-year-olds, and that would violate the convention. It doesn't mean the United States believes in child soldiers, but there's things like that when it comes to cluster munitions, landmines, etc. the big, the big out for the whole conversation is that Ukraine can get these munitions from other countries as well.
More on munitions and hardware. According to New York Times, it's just a passage from New York Times. The Ukrainian military has been firing thousands of artillery shells a day as it tries to hold Bakhmut. And we've been talking endlessly about the fight for Bakhmut. And the quote goes on, the bombardment has been so intense that the Pentagon has raised concerns with the officials in Kyiv, warning them that Ukraine was wasting ammunition at a key time, that is, considering the upcoming offensive. Is Pentagon strategic advice in falling on deaf ear in Kyiv, and why is it happening, in your opinion?
I don't know. And I don't know that it's on deaf ears in Kyiv, or perhaps it has something to do with the lack of training that much of the Ukrainian military has. This is a new military, and all the way down to the rate of fires, the types of fires that are used. Again, this kind of to your earlier question, Ukraine is relying on the advice of more experienced militaries and better trained and better equipped ones to tell them how to fight, so that they can go do it properly. Part of the United States' concern is it's not just the Ukraine running out of ammunition, it's the United States expending its own stockpiles to supply Ukraine and backfill NATO countries. So and U.S. officials have been open about this. They talk about it in interviews and press conferences all the time. The United States right now, the Pentagon is conducting a review of the U.S. defense industrial base's ability to make munitions. It's gotten that far down the chain, all the way back to the factory plants, just to make sure that the U.S. has its own stocks in order. But yes, there have been lots of reports from the beginning, and this is common to, I've covered many wars, and you've heard this in other scenarios where there are inexperienced fighters fighting for land in an intense, passionate kinds of ways. It's a lot easier to fire away than to hold your fire and think strategically for a longer term fight. Remember, this is a fight Ukraine and Russia both thought would be over long ago. Ukraine, just 3 months ago in January, was telling the world this fight will be over this year, and that's what they're thinking, and that's the rate of fire they're going to be firing at. But a few people outside of Ukraine think this war is going to be over this year.
You interviewed General Milley recently, and he has been repeating his statements about the difficulty of Ukraine winning in 2023. He was saying, quote unquote, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's a very difficult task. What did you gather from that conversation? Has the definition of Ukrainian victory somehow changed for the U.S. military commanders? Has it been moved to 2024, 2025, and what's the end game for this?
I don't think anything has changed, and I think Milley is speaking just as honestly and bluntly and as frankly as he does, when the camera is turned off and no one's around. That's just who he is. I think it has been interpreted as almost shocking that how dare a Western official or the Pentagon's chief, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, say anything but the most positive and hopeful statements there would be. If he doesn't say Ukraine will win, they will win 100%, total victory, every Russian soldier will be kicked out, including through Crimea. If he says anything short of that, there's always a group of people and critics and writers and pundits who will pounce on that and say, how could you? He views this, and I've spoken to him several times about it, he views this as not admitting defeat or undercutting Ukraine's chances or Ukraine's hope or morale. He views it as just straightforward honesty, that Russia has a far larger military, has far more weapons, has far more capability and far more patience, and it's not a democracy. It's run by a dictator who can do this as long as he wants to do it. So unless something changes inside of Russia, especially in the leadership, it's going to be, as he said, incredibly difficult for Ukraine to push those people out. What he also said, though, is that he often, and every general says this, all conflicts end at the negotiating table. And so you want to get your side in the best position possible when that comes, if it's anything other than total victory. And there's nothing wrong with saying that out loud and knowing it. That's what you're taught in class. It's in the history books. So I think Milley took a lot of heat for his statement, which I was asking him about a statement he originally made in November, and had his view of the war changed. And he didn't blink and didn't flinch You heard this answer. It's what you read. Yeah.
Kevin, Politico wrote this week that Washington gave Ukrainian authorities an advice akin to the one given to the Afghan government in 2021 before it fell, not to overextend its ambitions. And we know that from the leaked documents, and the press is picking up on that. We understand it has to do with the upcoming offensive. And from the leaked documents, we also learned that the optimism regarding the military and the offensive in the military and intelligence circles in Washington is very muted. New York Times reported American officials have assessed that it is unlikely the offensive will result in a dramatic shift in momentum in Ukraine's favor, pretty much in line with what Millie was saying and what you were describing. How do you sense this is amending the big picture for the offensive and the Ukrainian ambitions in that regard, if at all?
Well, I think it goes to what we were just saying, how Millie views the war. I mean, again, when publicly Zelensky and Ukrainians, and frankly, much of Eastern and Central European and those leaders as well, they're still saying that they will fight Russia till the very end, all or nothing, every inch, every soldier, every end. That's noble. That's their land. That's their people. But for neutral observers on the outside, it's less than believable. That may be what Zelensky has to say, but it's not an honest path toward peace. It doesn't mean you can't do both. And these are politicians. They can rally their publics and their constituents and their militaries with bold statements, while privately working towards some other way to end the fighting. And this is that's the next question too. Is end the fighting good enough? Is a frozen war good enough, like Korea? If it all stops today and Ukraine gives up Crimea or gives up everything east of the river, the Dnieper, but nothing else, what do you call that? Is it a total loss? Is it a total victory? It's probably neither of those things, but it saves lives and it ends the war. And it's the reality, the cold, hard reality of diplomacy and international politics. That doesn't fit well in a headline. That doesn't do well in a 24-hour news cable cycle, but it's what the administration in Washington is dealing with, a very difficult time.
Regarding Crimea, Kevin, I wanted to ask you about any insight you might have on that, because publicly, as you said, we're hearing statements about Ukraine's intention to go back to the borders of the 1991, which includes Crimea, and there is a resolution on the Hill right now advocating for that as well. But as you mentioned, there are realities of the war. There is need to, come to some conclusion with that. So my question is, do we know the extent of support that Washington is ready to render to Kiev to exactly reclaim Crimea? Will Washington support this idea?
That's a great question. Publicly, the administration has not changed its message, which is all that it takes, everything it takes till the end. The Secretary of Defense said it again in the last week at the Ukraine Contact Group meeting at Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany. That's publicly. Also publicly, again, people like General Milley are saying taking Crimea would be a whole nother way. We've written about this as well since the fall, about what would it really take to forcefully push the Russians off of Crimea. And we talked about, in short, it's not just crossing the land bridge and having a street fight. This is something that would look almost like a Normandy. It would require an amphibious invasion across water. It would require paratroops from the sky. It would require a whole electronic warfare cyber suite to go with it. And it's a level of joint operations between air, land, and sea forces that, frankly, Ukraine does not have. Experience they do not have. Training they do not have. Equipment they do not have. So it's great talk. But this isn't short distance or artillery ground combat like we've seen in the rest of the country. It is a whole other type of military operation that, frankly, I don't know anybody thinks is possible. Now, there is a general, Ben Hodges, everyone's familiar with. He's a former U.S. Army commander in Europe. He's probably the most senior and vocal person who says that he believes it is possible. So there are some who do, and they think it's not as big of a job as people think. And we've seen how badly Russia fights and how poorly they're able to defend anything. But it would still amount to extreme destruction for Crimea. And even politically, I'm not sure that's what Zelensky and the Ukrainians want.
Regarding political settlement, possibly we're just learning about the phone call between the Chinese leader and Zelensky, and it seems like it's coming after weeks of pressure on Xi Jinping to talk to Zelensky. And I'm just wondering whether we can read that as a sign, the Western pressure on Xi to talk to Zelensky and to talk about possibility of peace settlement, whether it actually signals Western fatigue with war and actually desire to end this, as you mentioned at some point, at the negotiating table and rather sooner than later.
It might. I'm hesitant to read the tea leaves about this meeting immediately. Listening to what Zelensky has said, they talked about listening to what Xi said, and then kind of seeing the initial reaction. Look, even in the United States, there are Republicans who support, who have only mild support of the Ukraine war, who don't have an endless support for Ukraine. They are blasting this because they hate China so much, and their fear of China and hate of China outweighs their desire to not fund Ukraine and to support Russia. So it becomes complicated even here. I don't know that it signals any desire closer to China's peace plan, which everybody laughed at and rejected and said it's not really a peace plan. I don't know that Washington is able to tell the Ukrainians who to talk to or not. Let them talk all they want. In the end, there's a little bit of good news, I think, in it, in that the Chinese did make statements like they took their old protection of territorial integrity, which they used to say, keep your hands off Taiwan, that's our territory. And now they're giving it to Zelensky. That's different than giving it to Russia, even though they kind of said the same thing. Territorial integrity, well then who gets Crimea? Is that Ukraine's territory or is that Russian? And the Chinese are, they're silent about that. So I think, economically, politically, militarily, the Chinese have just as much of an incentive for the fighting to stop as everybody else in the world. And if they can have a hand in making it stop, well, then it looks good for them and they're going to try. So I think politically in Washington, that's where the president here, President Biden, is facing criticism of not being the leading edge of any discussions toward peace, of any leading of Zelensky along and allowing Xi any space to come and play that role.
Kevin, probably my last question. If we go back to the leaks, we will probably be learning in the coming days more from those papers when it's picked up by the press. I wanted to ask you about the phenomenon in general. What was the most telling thing that we learned from the leaks and about them?
Well, there's a lot of lines to talk about with the leaks. I'm fascinated by number one. This wasn't just some average 21-year-old soldier who, had a bone to pick. It sounds like he was having fun. He was bragging. He was, boasting. But then people peel layers back, and it turns out he's not just a normal guy boasting to his friends. He already is a radicalized right-wing extremist at the age of 21. He's gun obsessed. He's military obsessed. There are reports that he's made racist statements, anti-Semitic statements. So you've got a young guy already who's been sucked into the vitriolic politics of the United States, and unbeknownst to the system that's supposed to protect the rest of the country from extremists like him. To be an intelligence analyst in the United States military and to get access, you're supposed to be cleared. And somehow that system has clearly failed. There's been a big push in Washington, frankly, because of the Trump administration era, to find extremists within the ranks of not just the military, but the intelligence community writ large, law enforcement as well, and kick them out. And there's a question about free speech. There's questions about political freedoms. But in the end, you're not allowed to be an extremist in the U.S. military. When you join the military, you give up rights. You don't have the same free speech rights as everybody else. And that whole system failed. And there's a political battle about it. The center right thinks like, wow, going after right-wing extremists is just an excuse to come after all of us on the right. And they were against these kind of efforts. So it just shows that the divisiveness continues, but that American politics, the divisiveness of American politics has tangible, actionable results. And in this case, it was turning a young intelligence analyst into a radical who decided to leak extremely sensitive information at the highest levels that's causing international concerns, revealing battle plans, endangering lives. And that's why he's in custody today.